343 BCE, northern Greece. A philosopher in his early 40s travels the road from Athens to Pella, capital of Macedonia. His name is Aristotle, and he is about to take on a student who will reshape the ancient world. In our last episode, we saw 13-year-old Alexander tame Bucephalus by seeing what no one else could see, a horse afraid of its own shadow, a problem solved through observation, not force. Philip recognized something in that moment. His son was not just brave or competitive. Alexander had a mind that could change everything, but only if it was properly trained. Philip II faced a problem. His son had received basic education. Tutors came and went. Alexander could quote Euripides. He had studied Homer. He knew the fundamentals. But Philip was planning something unprecedented, an invasion of the Persian Empire, the conquest of Asia. And when Philip died, whether in battle or from assassination, Alexander would inherit that mission. A future king needed more than basic learning. He needed to understand politics, ethics, strategy. He needed to think like a philosopher and act like a conqueror. Philip needed the best teacher in the Greek world. Several candidates were considered. Isocrates, the famous orator, but he was in his 90s, too old for a multi-year commitment. Speusippus, who led Plato's academy, brilliant, but his approach was abstract, theoretical. Philip needed someone who understood politics and power, not just pure philosophy. And then there was personal history to consider. Aristotle was not yet the legendary philosopher we know today. He was 41 years old, respected in Athens, a former student of Plato who had spent 20 years at the academy, but Aristotle had left Athens after Plato died. He had traveled, studied biology on the island of Lesbos, married, lost his wife. By 343 BCE, he was working in Atarneus, a city in Asia Minor, under a ruler named Hermaeus. And that connection, Hermaeus, was part of why Philip wanted Aristotle. Philip was not just hiring a tutor, he was forming an alliance. Hermaeus controlled territory on the western edge of the Persian Empire. If Philip was going to invade Persia, he needed allies there, intelligence, local support. Bringing Aristotle to Macedonia meant strengthening ties with Hermaeus. Education and politics combined. But there was another reason, a family connection. Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, had been court physician to Philip's father, King Amyntas III. Aristotle had spent part of his childhood in Pella. He knew Macedonia. He understood the court. He was not some Athenian intellectual who looked down on Macedonians as barbarians. Well, he probably did think Macedonians were somewhat barbaric. Most Greeks did. But he had personal history there, connections, trust. The offer Philip made was extraordinary. First, Aristotle would be paid handsomely. Exact amounts are not recorded, but this was a royal commission. Second, Philip would rebuild Aristotle's hometown. Stagira had been destroyed by Philip himself. Years earlier, during his campaigns to expand Macedonia's borders, Philip had razed the city. Now, to secure Aristotle as Alexander's tutor, Philip promised to rebuild Stagira and resettle its citizens. Imagine that negotiation. I destroyed your hometown. Now I will rebuild it. In exchange, teach my son. It was both generous and calculated. Philip was very good at calculated generosity. This is the level of strategic thinking that made Macedonia the most powerful force in Greece, and we have only scratched the surface. In Episode 1, we saw how Alexander's childhood shaped his psychology. In Episode 2, we watched him prove himself with Bucephalus. Now, we are seeing how Philip orchestrated every advantage. If you want to follow this complete journey, the education, the battles, the empire, subscribe now, because what happens at Mieza will echo across 3 continents. But Philip added something else, something that reveals how well he understood Aristotle. Philip assigned royal gamekeepers to assist Aristotle with his biological research. You see, Aristotle was fascinated by the natural world, animals, plants, anatomy. He had spent years on Lesbos studying marine life, dissecting creatures, cataloging species. Philip gave him access to Macedonia's forests, its hunting grounds, its wildlife.
For Aristotle, this was an opportunity to continue his research while teaching. For Philip, it was a way to keep Aristotle happy and invested. The deal was struck. Aristotle accepted. And Philip made one more decision that would shape the future. Alexander would not study alone. Philip selected sons of Macedonia's most important noble families to study alongside his son. This served multiple purposes. First, these boys would become Alexander's inner circle, his companions, his future generals. Second, it ensured powerful families stayed loyal. Your son studying with the prince, educated by Greece's greatest philosopher? That is an honor, a bond. Third, it created competition. Alexander thrived on competition. Among the students, Hephaestion, who would become Alexander's closest friend and possibly his lover. Likely Ptolemy, who would one day rule Egypt. Possibly Cassander, future king of Macedonia, and eventually Alexander's enemy. These boys, aged 13 to 15, would spend the next 3 years together, learning, training, competing, forging bonds that would, for a brief, explosive moment, hold together an empire spanning 3 continents, and then fight brutal wars over its pieces. Philip chose a location far from the royal court, Mieza, about 19 miles from Pella. Remote, quiet, away from politics. Later biographers like Plutarch describe it romantically, a sacred grove, stone benches under ancient trees. The reality was probably less poetic. Archaeological evidence suggests a large gymnasium, which in Greek culture meant a combination of school and athletic facility. Classrooms, wrestling areas, living quarters. This was not a peaceful retreat. This was an intensive institution where young aristocrats would be pushed intellectually and physically. 343 BCE, Aristotle arrives at Mieza. Alexander is 13 years old. Competitive, ambitious, convinced of his divine ancestry. But he is still rough, still forming. Aristotle sees potential, but he also sees a wild mind that needs discipline. The education is about to begin. Aristotle was not going to teach Alexander random facts. He was going to teach him how to think. Logic, how to construct an argument, how to identify fallacies. Rhetoric, how to speak convincingly, how to move crowds. Ethics, what makes a good life, what makes a good leader. And natural philosophy, what we would now call science, biology, geography, medicine. But underneath all of this, Aristotle would teach something else, something darker. A worldview. Aristotle believed in natural hierarchy, that some people were born superior to others, that Greeks were naturally suited to rule, and non-Greeks, barbarians, were naturally suited to be ruled. In his later writings, particularly the Politics, Aristotle would argue, the barbarian and the slave are by nature one and the same. He taught his students, including Alexander, be a leader to the Greeks and a despot to the barbarians. This was not just philosophy. This was justification for conquest, for empire. And Alexander was listening. We need to understand something about ancient education. It was not just about transferring knowledge. It was about shaping character, shaping how a student saw the world. When Aristotle taught Alexander that some people were meant to rule and others to be ruled, he was giving the future conqueror a moral framework, a way to justify what was coming. The conquest of Persia would not just be about power or revenge. It would be about bringing Greek civilization to the barbarian world, about fulfilling a natural order. At least, that is what Alexander would tell himself. For the next 3 years, from age 13 to 16, Alexander will study at Mieza. Logic, ethics, politics, and science. But more than that, he will forge the relationships that will define his future. With Hephaestion, with Ptolemy, with the boys who will become the men who conquer the world. You have now seen how Alexander's childhood shaped his psychology, how he proved himself with Bucephalus, and how Philip orchestrated the education that would sharpen his son into a weapon. This is a journey through every step that built history's greatest conqueror. Subscribe now to continue following Alexander's path, because understanding who he became means understanding everything that made him.